involved following 3 Milwaukee families for 7 years as they moved on and off the welfare rolls. And it's not only extremely well written and moving, but it's particularly insightful in showing structural factors, Bill Clinton, the policy making at the federal level, and then the ramifications for daily life. He's now back at the Times, and in December he also wrote an impressive piece on children's tax credits and how they really don't benefit the children from the poorest families. In 2013, when I was president of the American Sociological Association, I asked him to speak at the annual meeting in 2014, but he couldn't because he was in Manila doing research. So he not only writes about long journeys, but his own book has been one. And it's now completed and recently released. It's for sale after the talk at a great discount, 50%. And he's here to speak about his book, A Good Provider is One Who Leaves, One Family and Migration in the 21st Century. And the title of his talk today is The Greatest Anti-Poverty Success Story I Know. Please join me in welcoming Jason.
Thank you so much. It is the greatest anti-poverty success story I know, and I'm excited to share it with you, so thank you for your time. 30 years ago, I was a young reporter living in Manila with an interest in shanty towns, the scrapwood mazes that cover the city and much of the developing world. And I called the country's most famous nun who lived and worked in a shanty town called Reverberations. I didn't say so, but I was hoping she would help me move in. Sister Rosalie Tan was no ordinary nun. She was a friend of the new president, Cory Aquino, and busy on a commission drafting a new constitution. "Call me back in a few months," she snapped. Hoping for a quicker audience, I told her I'd been working with another nun in her audience, in her order, thinking maybe she'd see me sooner. Apparently they weren't friends. "That's a mistake," she said. "Meet me tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in front of the Manila Zoo." "Are you CIA?" she asked when I arrived. "Well, you wouldn't tell me if you were, would you?" Sister Christine let me know that living with a Leverisa family wouldn't work. "The poor are magnificent people, unlike the rich," she said. "But Americans need toilets, and most shanties in Leverisa lack them. A family would feel a need to buy me special food. I'd be a burden." Sister Christine talked on. She denounced the American military bases in the Philippines. She denounced American corporations. And she waved, she said she let me know that she wasn't an imperialist in a way that felt like an accusation. Then she waved her hand above her head and she said, "That's all up here," meaning politics. "Somehow we need to do more to build links between the first and the third worlds. If I returned in a few days, she'd see what she could do." So I came back thinking she'd use the time between our meetings to approach a family or two. And instead, she led me into the alley and auctioned me off on the spot. I knew just enough Tagalog to know the first person she approached was like horrified. "Hindi puede," it's not, "No, sister, it's not possible." Second woman said the same, and the third was simply struck mute. Her thin patience was exhausted at this point. Sister Christine stalked off and said, "If you don't want him, pass him on to somebody else. Don't cook him anything special. If he gets sick, too bad." I don't know who was more frightened, the woman, Tita, or me. We drew a crowd. Somebody yelled, "Ask him if he eats rice." Somebody else yelled, "Ask him if he wants to marry a Filipina." Tita stalled for as long as she could, and then she gave in to what she took to be Sister Christine's request and told me I could move in and sleep on her floor. I was interested in slum life, not migration, but migration was how the family survived. Tita's husband, Emmett, was a guest worker in Saudi Arabia. He was 5,000 miles away cleaning pools, while Tita was home raising their 5 children on the money he sent back. This started as an act of desperation, but it became a way of life. All 5 of those kids grew up to become overseas workers too, and they're part of a large extended family spread out across the globe. So just about anything that could happen to a migrant family, good or bad, has happened to somebody in the clan. The book takes its title from Tita's sister, Peachy, who was living in a straw hut and watching her siblings come back from jobs overseas and build cement block homes. She got envious and she turned to her husband and said that he needed to go find overseas work too, and with a phrase that became the family motto. She told him, "A good provider is one who leaves." The member of the family I came to know best was Tita's daughter, Rosalie. She used her father's remittances to make the leap from the slums to nursing school, and then spent 2 decades in the Persian Gulf, mostly Abu Dhabi, all the while hoping to get to the States. She was just about to give up. She was starting to apply for a job in Canada when a hurricane slammed into the Texas Gulf Coast with like Katrina-like consequences. 1/6 of the island didn't come back. And the hospital there was unable to bring in enough nurses to open a new ward. Out of it was offering $5,000 bonuses, just couldn't get them to stay on the island. So in an act of semi-desperation, they looked abroad and hired 20 foreign nurses to come open a new ward. So Rosalie finally had her chance. She arrived in the summer of 2012 with her husband Chris and their 3 young children. Her period of adjustment coincided with the rise of Donald Trump and a surge of conservative populism that regards assimilation as a failure and immigrants as a threat to jobs, culture, safety, fiscal health, national security. I came to think of the Villanueva story as a kind of retort. With a house in the suburbs and kids on the honor roll, they achieved in 3 years a degree of assimilation that used to take 3 generations, and they did it moreover in Metro Houston, a hub of pro-immigrant sentiment deep in red state America, which I take as a hint, perhaps, that immigration is less divisive in daily life as it is in national politics. Had the chance to talk a little earlier with Roger Smith about this, about how there's kind of 2 traditions or 2 narratives in America operating at the same time at the national level. If all you knew about politics at the national level was that from the national level, you'd think it was just a story of endless conflict, and yet you have cities like Houston undergoing great change with, I think, less than social conflict than we might have expected. In a country of 44 million immigrants, no family stands for the whole. The Villanuevas merely stand for the large part missing from the from the presidential Twitter feed. And Rosalie's experience also happens to be the most successful anti-poverty story I know. It begins in the 1950s when a young boy on a distant island was smuggled aboard a crowded ferry for an overnight trip to Manila. This is Rosalie's father, Emmett, who was recently orphaned, and a distant relative visiting the province had agreed to take him home. Home was Leverisa, a squalid mudflat ruled by warring gangs, where sanitation consisted of flying saucers, bundles of waste wrapped in newspapers and flung into the surrounding canals. It was a kind of a grim place, but Emmett liked the tumult of city life, the garish jeepneys, the babble of dialects, the men throwing dice in the alley. He wore his geniality as a shield and was quick to make friends. Drawn to commerce more than to school, Emmett spent his youth in traffic, hawking newspapers and cigarettes, and then in his early 20s, he landed his first real job, cleaning a government pool. He's walking home with his first paycheck, and he spies a beautiful young woman across the alley, ironing clothes. It's the love story. She's like at once the most frail and most beautiful woman he's ever seen. It's Tita, and Tita has no interest. She considers Emmett plain looking and, quote, poorer than a rat, but his persistence carried the day. They married in 1967, and 5 children followed in alliterative fashion. This will make sense to you only if you're Filipino. The kids' names are Rolando, Rowena, Rosalie, Roldan, and Rosalie. Rowena, who's Rosalie's older sister, was born with a heart defect that left her perpetually weak and in need of medicine that Emmett couldn't afford. After years of fretting over her frail health, Emmett dropped to his knees and he asked God to make a decision. Take her, bring her up to heaven, God, or let him have her. And God answered in a mysterious way. Soon after, Emmett got an offer to work in Saudi Arabia. He'd be away from his family for 2 years in an Islamic autocracy where stories of abused workers are rife, but he'd earn 10 times his Manila pay for doing exactly the same work. He accepted on the spot. It took him a week to get up the courage to go home and tell Tita. By the time I arrived, 7 years later, Emmett was on his 3rd contract, Rowena had her medicine, and the house was one of the few in Leverisa with a toilet. I'd found my place among the poor. I achieved my goal, but I wasn't really sure what to do with them, and they weren't sure what to do with me. Language gaps and excessive politeness kept me and Tita strangers for a few days until she solicited my help with a gluing project, turning newspapers into paper bags. I botched it so badly she threatened to mark them Made in USA. Half of Tita's life revolved around drudgery. I'd be on my floor mat before dawn, listening to her boil the breakfast rice. I'd be back there again at midnight, listening to her wrestle the laundry. But the other half revolved around slum solidarity. She was part of Sister Christine's slum uplift group, an organization of Bible studies and livelihood projects, sort of built around the question, what would Jesus do if Jesus were a squatter? Tita was the manager of the co-op store and responsible for bringing in 2,000 eggs a week, which she stacked under a fluorescent light in the kitchen to keep the rats away. I took her to a movie one day just to give her a break from the house, a Tagalog movie, and we were sitting in the dark, and all of a sudden she like jumps up and slaps her head like out of a cartoon, and I thought I must have missed a plot twist in the Tagalog film, and she'd forgotten to write down one of her egg transfers, and she had to get up in the middle of the movie and make a note. I mean, just her whole life revolved around, I came to think of these eggs like, metaphoric for the fragility of her existence or Philippine democracy or something. Between her chores, Tita told me she'd been asking God a question. Why, if you love your son, are so many Filipinos poor? This is the central question of faith. Why does God, being omnipotent, allow suffering? And it's a question with special meaning in a place that suffers as much as Leverisa. But it wasn't a question I expected a besieged woman with a 6th grade education to be so readily able to articulate. I asked her what God had answered. Not yet, she said, as if mocking her own presumptuous attempts to fortify her faith. I'm not sure what I expected to find, really, in the slums of Manila, but it wasn't a woman in a worn housecoat trying to live out the gospel beneath a tower of eggs. Rosalie was Tita's main helper, a shy, dutiful girl who always got cast as the nun in the school youth group plays. If you were going to look around the slums and pick like the kid who had the drive to get out of the shantytown, I don't think you would have picked Rosalie. There were other kids who were more outgoing or more academically inclined, more seemingly ambitious. The B's and C's that Rosalie brought into high school showed no special academic promise. But the most telling line on her transcript wasn't her grades. It was her attendance. Through 4 years of poverty and literal revolution in the Philippines, she never missed a class. About high school is where I got grit, she later told me. I don't think she knew she was quoting a famous Penn academic. The surest way for a Filipino to advance was to become a nurse. The U.S. had established the country's first nursing schools during the colonial occupation. Filipinos trained in English on an American curriculum, and over the decades, thousands had migrated to the States, so there was a network in place. But nursing school was a leap for a girl from the slums, but both financially and academically. But it was one Rosalie managed to make, if barely. They actually screen out the nursing students after 2 years. You have to keep an average of 80. I think the nursing school does that to keep up their pass rates on the board exams. And they're a little indelicate about it. The dean just puts up a list of the students by name who are being asked to leave the school. So Rosalie shows up one day and finds that she's got a 79.5, and she's on the list of expelled students. And a group of them go filing out of the nursing school crying to go try to find another nursing school to apply to, Rosalie among them. And for reasons Rosalie never quite understood, the dean changed her mind and rounded her up. So it was salvation by upward rounding. She managed to stay in and finish her nursing degree. But there's like 5 or 6 of those moments in the course of her 20-year odyssey to the States where she becomes that close to not making it. She graduates from nursing school. An uncle comes home and says there's a hospital comes home from Saudi Arabia, says there's a hospital in Mecca, outside Mecca, that's hiring. Rosalie went abroad. She met her husband on her second contract in Saudi. She met her husband, Chris, a Filipino man who was working in a factory in Jeddah. They had to court secretly to avoid the religious police, and they came home married in the Philippines. And then at this point, family logistics get complicated. The quick version is they have 3 kids. The kids are mostly back in the Philippines with Rosalie's parents, who leave the slums and move back to a farm. And Rosalie and Chris are in Abu Dhabi. So they're mostly separated from their kids. This is supposed to last briefly till they all get to the States, but it went on for 8 years. And during this time, Rosalie and I, all this time while she's going to nursing school, while she moves to Saudi, while she has kids, we're in touch, but we didn't see each other for 2 decades. And then I went back to write a story for the New York Times Magazine. The light bulb moment for me in understanding the importance of migration was learning that remittances, the sums that migrants send home, are more than 3 times the world's foreign aid budgets combined. Migration is the world's largest anti-poverty program. If you think that poor people should do more to help themselves, migrants do. No country does more to promote migration than the Philippines, where the government trains and markets overseas workers and presidents celebrate them as heroes. Migration is to the Philippines what cars once were to Detroit. It's the civil religion. The president of the Philippines literally goes to the airport once a year with a plate of cookies to welcome home the visiting workers, and they roll out a literal red carpet, like a half-mile long, down the hall of the airport. So I got to go along on one of these ceremonies once. I squeezed in the elevator with the president of the Philippines. I had time for one quick question. She's Gloria, President Arroyo, is about this tall. She has a PhD from Georgetown. I said, Madam President, why do you call the migrants heroes? And she looked at me like I was an utter dunce and said, because they send home $1 billion a month. The paper had sent me to explore migration's impact on Philippine culture. And I thought this might be a little too subtle a story for an outsider to be able to write about. I don't speak Tagalog, not familiar with, in depth with the Filipino popular culture. And then I landed and I drove past the central bank that had the year's remittance tally lit up in Christmas lights, 8 stories high. So the story wasn't subtle. I could get it. 250 million migrants have spread out across the globe, and they support a population back home that's as big, if not bigger. But what characterizes modern migration isn't just its size, but its ubiquity. Ireland has had its first African-born mayor. Mongolians do scut work in Prague. Every story's country differs, but the dynamics are the underlying principles are basically the same. That rich aging countries need workers, workers in poor countries need jobs. Cheap travel speeds the migrants' way, and instant communication spreads word that opportunity awaits. War and persecution have pushed the numbers of displaced persons to record highs. Captured by the sweep of the migration story, its importance in Rosalie's life, its importance in the Philippines, and then, as I saw, its importance globally, I decided I wanted to expand this magazine article into a book built around Rosalie and her family. But in narrative terms, I had a real problem. It was a story about Filipinos in Abu Dhabi. So the relevance to American life was peripheral at best. And I spent a couple of years trying to think about how I could make it seem relevant to the U.S. Would I find another family, or how could I bring it to, and then I just decided, it was what it was. I was interested enough in this that I was going to write a book about Filipinos in Abu Dhabi, and it would be what it was. And a few weeks after I committed to the project, the narrative gods smiled. Rosalie got her job in Texas. So I didn't have to go to Abu Dhabi. It shortened my commute, and it gave it an American flavor. It also really profoundly changed the book, because it started out as a book about kind of overseas development and the effect of remittances on sending countries. And in the end, I spent a lot of time just following Rosalie's kids around. So it became a story about second and third graders in Texas. I met Rosalie in Manila, and we traveled to Galveston, where things got off to a rocky start. She had wanted to come to the United States for 3/4 of her life, and she came expecting, just had it up on a pedestal. She came expecting Disney World, and wound up in this declining blue-collar town with a vista of vacant lots. The cost of living was higher than she expected. American English was hard to understand. When we got to Galveston, somebody suggested we grab lunch at a little hole in the wall. And Rosalie got very worried and leaned over to me and said, "How are we going to eat in the hole in the wall?" And the hole in the wall served poor boys. Rosalie wanted to know why not poor girls. World travelers aren't always worldly. Rosalie had lived abroad for most of her life, but always in a cocoon of Filipinos. There's so many Filipinos in Abu Dhabi that you can go to mass in Tagalog. She looked around Galveston, where are all the Filipinos? Homesick, she retreated into the familiar. There's 7,641 islands in the Philippines, and her apartment became the 7,642nd with purple yam in the refrigerator and Tagalog soap operas on TV, she would keep a Skype connection open for 13 hours a day just to sit there and listen to the roosters crow. The first place Rosalie felt comfortable was in the hospital, not because the work was easy, but because she felt equal to its difficulties. Work for her became a vehicle of assimilation. I think there's a broader point here that we generally think that America does a better job than Europe of integrating immigrants. I think one of the reasons that is true is that there are more entry-level jobs. It's just the structure of our economy. It's easier to get into the workforce. And for both Rosalie and her husband, I think going to the job was sort of the place where they learned about America. One thing to emphasize about Rosalie's work is that she didn't take an American job. As I said, the hospital had been trying for years to lure enough nurses back to this island. They couldn't get them to come and stay. So she didn't take an American job. She filled a job they've been trying to fill, and in doing so, she improved the community's health care. Another thing to note is that Rosalie is a really good nurse. So I had intuited as much from her, but it was really wonderful to see it. The hospital just gave me a pair of scrubs and let me follow her as much as I wanted. My wife is a health policy official, and she said I was a walking HIPAA violation. But the most telling testimonial I got about Rosalie's nursing care actually wasn't in the hospital. It was in an aisle of a Walmart. We were grocery shopping, and this woman comes running up out of nowhere and says, "Remember me?" And Rosalie's blank look makes it clear she did not. The woman says, "GI bleed, bad GI bleed." And Rosalie brightens and she says, "Room 13. It'd been 6 months. And everyone, yeah, bad GI, oh, I remember you. The woman had no idea who I was, but she turned to me and she just started gushing. She said, "You can just really tell she loves to take care of people. It wasn't like this is just her job." And I heard that over and over again, which is interesting because people kept saying it wasn't just about the money with Rosalie, which, but it was, of course, partly about the money, but it was about more than the money. One patient recalled waking up from surgery and looking at Rosalie's face. "I just remember thinking she's got the kindest eyes," she said. Another said, "It's like she feels your pain." So, given all the political talk of immigrants taking jobs, I wondered if her patients had any resentments at this ward. It was an entire ward full of Filipino nurses. So I made a point of asking in private when Rosalie wasn't around, and not one said they did. They noticed her care, not her ethnicity. If anybody would resent her, I thought it would be a woman I met one night, an 80-year-old African-American woman who told me a life story out of Zora Neale Hurston. She had plowed cotton and behind mules and been beaten by her husband, and she had always aspired to become a nurse and never gotten above minimum wage work as a nursing aide. So I thought if anybody might resent somebody coming from abroad and getting that job, it would be her. How did she feel about the foreigners getting the job, I asked. Though she was black and Rosalie was Filipino, she said she considered them part of the same clan, a tribe of low-born strivers. "I admire everybody and anybody who's trying to get up a little bit higher," she said. "Don't stop, keep going." 6 months after Rosalie arrived, the family followed. Christine was 9, Laura was 7, and Dominique was 6. After years apart, they weren't just learning to live together in a new country, they were learning to live together, period. They were a new family. The kids assimilated rapidly, but in surprising and contrasting ways. Christine, the eldest, adopted the popularity-seeking ways of middle school girls, snapping selfies by the thousand and posting them on Instagram accounts with names like Christine Cute and Swelfie Queen. I have to say, nothing in my experience as a reporter or a parent of 2 boys really prepared me for a reporting assignment following 2 middle school girls around. One of my favorite scenes in the book is of Christine playing Barbies, and she's one of the Barbies. It was really her story that she was projecting out. The Barbies lived in a shanty town, but then instantly got on a plane and went to America and became rich people. And she was acting this out with the Barbies. She's Americanizing. Her teachers groaned when she would Christine's image of the got her image of America from the Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. So do any of you know who London Tipton is? She's like the ditzy rich girl on the cruise. So that's who Christine. She's going to be. She is out to become the girl born to shop. That was Christine's vision. Laura, her younger sister, is Americanizing too, but in a totally different way. She's got this special gift for blending her Filipino and her American selves. I traced the story of Laura's assimilation through a story about Rosa Parks. When Laura first arrived, it's Black History Month, and her teacher tells her Rosa Parks is a hero. But the idea of a hero in handcuffs makes no sense to a little girl straight from the Philippines, where children are admonished to respect their elders and obey authority. She didn't listen to the policeman, Laura said, so she couldn't be a hero. And besides, heroes wear capes, so she couldn't be a hero. A year later, Laura's sitting at the dinner table picking at her rice, and she announces out of nowhere, I sort of agree with Rosa Parks. She'd paid her money like everybody else, so it wasn't fair for her to sit in the back of the bus. But what Laura really admired wasn't just Rosa Parks' principles, it was also her politeness. That when the policeman came and arrested her, she didn't say any bad words. So for an immigrant girl deftly blending two cultures, Rosa Parks became like the civil rights icon who didn't curse. I thought momentarily this was a unique gift to Laura, but 3,400, it extends beyond Laura. Studying 3,400 kids in New York, sociologist Phil Kasnitz and his colleagues found the children of immigrants, on average, outperformed the children of native-born peers, and they did so despite having parents who had less education and less money. So how could this be? The sociologists came up with a theory they called second-generation advantage. So two parts of it I think will be intuitive and familiar to you. One is that the children of immigrants are self-selected for their drive and ambition, and they pass some of those qualities on to their children. And the other is that immigrants enjoy dense ethnic networks that kind of act as a sort of guidance system and social welfare system, and natives lack them. But the sociologists also cited a third factor, which is just that the children of immigrants benefit from living at a cultural crossroads. They can combine the best of both worlds, their parents and their peers. It's a little bit of an abstract concept, but what helped me understand is if you think of the great creativity in New York City in the mid-20th century when the children of the Ellis Island immigrants were coming of age, it took a Russian-born Jew, Irving Berlin, to write a song called I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas and God Bless America. There's just something about the vitality of blending two cultures. So Laura turns out to be second generation personified. Her Filipino traits included her manners, her faith, her close family bonds, but from the U.S. she got a reduced sense of class and gender constraints, and above all she got a license to ask questions. Nothing in her Philippine life had encouraged her to probe. On the contrary, Filipino children are taught to obey their elders, not to interrogate them, and a class of 70 kids had little time for raised hands. But American teachers loved questions, and Laura obliged them. She'd run in the class in the morning. Do fish sleep? Is Galveston an empire? Is the leaning town of Pisa going to fall? She said, do nurses have to be caring? Maybe I'll just be a doctor. Rosalie worked the night shifts. She'd come home, she'd get a few hours sleep, and the kids would come home in the afternoon and wake her up, and Laura would still have all these questions, and Rosalie would always say, Laura, look it up on the Google. Curious how she had grown curious, Laura formed her own assimilation theory. She was new to the country and afraid of having to repeat second grade, so she told herself, I should be interested right now, and then being interested became a habit. Or put differently, life at the cultural crossroads had encouraged new ways of thinking, just as the New York sociologists had said. One day, we stopped for an after-school snack, and Laura sprang a sly question. She said, do you know how to infer? It's not a question any third grader had ever asked me. I frowned, trying to remember. I'm going to teach you, she said. And she paused to dip her French fry in her Oreo McFlurry and increase the suspense. My editor wrote back a note on the margin of the manuscript that said that was the grossest line she'd gotten in a submission all year. It's like when you say, oh, it's really cold, it's really snowy outside, Laura said. I didn't tell you what season it was, but you can infer it's winter. And she stabbed the air with her milky fry. You see, it works. After 2 years in the States, the foreign nurses finished their contracts and got hired as permanent staff. So pay raises and permanent status at the hospital ignited a real estate boom. 6 of the Filipinos bought new homes in the same subdivision, and 3, including Rosalie, shared a cul-de-sac. So after 3 years in the United States, that badge of belonging, a home in the suburbs, was hers. And a month later, Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign with an attack on immigrants, whom he called criminals, terrorists, welfare cheats, a threat to jobs, wages, housing, tax bills, and general living conditions. He offered the cheering crowds a parable about immigrant treachery he called The Snake. It's the tale of a kind woman who takes in a stranger and is repaid with a venomous bite. Rosalie wasn't a snake. She was a nurse. In standard cost-benefit terms, her move was a triple win. Good for her patients, good for the family she supports in the Philippines. You know, the National Academy of Sciences did a cost-benefit study of immigrant, and it ran these calculations, 200 pages worth, depending on the education, your background, and the spending level of the states, how much it would cost the United States. Based on that, I think Rosalie's family came out as, over 75 years, they were going to be a fiscal plus at the state, federal, and local level of $500,000. So there's a number you can attach to it. But to me, cost-benefit analysis isn't the heart of her story. Rosalie's escape from Leverisa was a minor miracle. Migration was her vehicle of salvation. It respected her talent, rewarded her sweat, and enlarged her capacity for giving. It made her life deeper, fuller, and more filled with hope. That her quest ended in Texas is something for Americans to cheer. It's good for your country to be the place people go to make dreams come true. I asked Rosalie how the house compared with the hovel where we had met, with the leaks, rats, crowds, and stench. Oh my God, she told the kids. Big difference. Mommy grew up in a shanty. Christine looked up from her Instagram account and said, "What's a shanty, Mommy?" Thank you. I think I have some slides, right? Just this?
First, let me call yours up.
Oh. So,
there we go. Let me make sure the clicker's actually on. There you go.
there you go. That's the before. That's Leverisa. Sister Christine, that's at Moloch and Young Palace after the Marcoses had fled. Some of you may remember Imelda Marcos left behind 1,000 pairs of shoes. And Sister Christine would take the kids from the slums to the palace to see the 1,000 pairs of shoes. Sister Christine grew up in a very wealthy family. She was educated in the States, and she would lecture the kids from the slums about the virtues of poverty. She only had, Sister Christine liked to say she only had one pair of shoes. She was trying to get Rosalie to join the convent, and Rosalie didn't mind marrying Jesus, but she didn't want to take a vow of poverty. Having come by her own more honestly, she said she didn't need 1,000 pairs of shoes, but like a dozen might be nice, and a new handbag or something. Poorer than a rat, but looking pretty good in that picture. Tita and Emmett on their wedding day. This is right before Emmett went abroad. That's Rosalie, second from the left. Tita was either pregnant or soon after pregnant with their youngest child, who was in diapers when Emmett left. That's Rowena on the left, who had the heart defect. So not only did Emmett get a pay raise of 10 times, but it's interesting to think he got it for doing exactly the same work, cleaning a pool.
It was construction.
Emmett worked at a Saudi air base. His employer, the Saudis hired a company in Alabama to run the sports program at the gym, and they in turn hired a recruiter to bring in staff to do things like clean the pool. So he was technically an employee of a Filipino personnel firm that was hired by Americans who were hired by the Saudis. Would you let that man move into your shanty? There's Tita with the eggs. So Emmett came home from Saudi halfway through my stay there, and actually I was a little worried. Like, the man of the house is coming home and find out there's like a scruffy guy sleeping on his floor. How's he going to react? I was out of the country for a few days when he came home. When I came back, Emmett had gone and gotten me a welcome home cake with my name on it. So that was a pretty nice greeting. When he came home, it was great for the first few months. Everybody's excited. Emmett's home. He throws a party. He fixes up the shanty, and then money starts to run short, and he can't find work in the Philippines. So eventually, he had to go back to Saudi. But there was a period where he was getting really angry at Tita about the eggs because he thought it was running up the light bill to run the fluorescent light over the eggs. On the Rosalie's nursing school graduation photo, on the back of the photo, Tita has actually tabulated her debts, who she owes, how much, all the different people, relatives and lenders that she had borrowed from to get Rosalie through nursing school. That was in Abu Dhabi when I did the Times Magazine story, so I think she's supposed to be gazing longingly towards Galveston there. Christine left, Dominique center, and Laura's full name is Precious Lara Villanueva. She's named after a Filipino beauty queen. We didn't actually take a trip to the Statue of Liberty. We took a trip to New Jersey because Chris had a relative he hadn't seen in 20 years who lived in New Jersey, and her daughter was having a debutante party. On 18th birthday, Filipinos often have a debut. And so we went up for that, but while we were nearby, we made a dash to the Statue of Liberty, and we mistimed it. Chris was late for his plane, so we had to take the ferry over and get the next ferry back. So it was a real harried moment. We were kind of stuck there in the armpit of the Statue of Liberty and didn't get the full view. And Rosalie's fondest memory of the day was that the guy running the gift shop on the boat was Filipino.
Where did
The Swelfie Queen.
Where did Chris work?
In Texas?
Yeah.
The question was, where did Chris work in Texas? He worked briefly as a janitor, and then got hired at the city wastewater plant through the Filipino placement network, ethnic network. A Filipino guy really went to the mat to get him hired. Laura, where I did my finest interviews. She was the slowest eater in the family, so to find out what Laura was thinking about Rosa Parks, she would have to sit beside her at the table. She really got into all kinds of civil rights heroes, but also female heroes. So she would debate with herself, like which of her heroines were the greatest, Clara Barton or Jane Addams or Rosa Parks, and she decided that it was Harriet Tubman because every Filipino understands this idea of sacrificing for your family, but what struck her about Harriet Tubman was she had risked her life for people who weren't her relatives. She had done it for strangers, like opened up a new moral universe to her. So I thought that was another moment where Laura's kind of creatively drawing on both Filipino and American perspectives. The new house. The new house compared to the old house. Maybe I didn't need to write the book. I could have just boiled it down to a slide and saved myself. That's a pretty good arc right there. So Annette knows this. You do this intensive work reporting on people, then you have to go write the book. So the kids, when you're writing about kids, in the meantime, the kids grow up. So most of the scenes in the book, Christine that's her on the right there. She's in 4th to 6th grade, so she's now a high school junior. The book came out in the summer, and the Times ran an excerpt, so that's the kids from this summer, the family. Oh, big news. I went to my first naturalization ceremony in Houston last week, and Rosalie and Chris are now American citizens. 2,600 people file into this auditorium, and there's a federal judge who said that he brings two props. I think, yeah, there is. He brings two props to his, each naturalization ceremony. One is his mother's naturalization certificate. She's from Australia. And the other is John F. Kennedy's book, A Nation of Immigrants. And we had to wait about an hour for them to get that picture. Everybody gets up and swears at once, and their oath, and then you get these certificates, and there's a big line. Dominique on the left is saying, "Can we go get pizza? Can we go get pizza?" And Rosalie was determined to get her picture made. So there they are. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Yes, ma'am.
There was quite a bit of talk last night during the Democratic debate along the lines that the American dream can't be realized in America anymore, the dream of getting from poor to rich. This is one story of someone doing it, but is it your sense from the literature that, in fact, immigrants in the United States still do, in large percentages, actualize this American dream?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I think there's some significant concerns about in terms of the second generation, about the children of immigrants with very low levels of education or the undocumented, that whether they'll be able to achieve upward mobility, particularly in the current enforcement climate. I think that's an area of people worry about that and are right to. But on balance, as I said, there's the major studies that have been done of second generation so far show the children of immigrants, on average, outperforming the children of native-born peers, even when they start from having less education or income. I did an earlier book on a family of welfare recipients, and they were African-American women in Milwaukee. And it was in the 1990s, a time of a strong economy, and they had been poor for generations, not only their own lives, but their families' lives. I traced their family history back to slavery, so it's a 6th generation story. And I asked Angie at one point, the main character, Angie, it's a big, prosperous country, lots of people get ahead here, kind of, what's holding you back? Why can't you get with the program? And I was trying to provoke her a little bit just to get an answer out of her, and she kind of, in a appealingly profane way, told me that all that stuff wasn't meant for her, and that was meant for. She gave a racialized answer that opportunity, essentially, that is the suburbs, the house in the suburbs, that's for white people. That wasn't meant for us. So she gave a narrative kind of being an heir to racial defeat. And I can, of course, I already knew Rosalie. I always had in the back of my mind, if Rosalie could get to Milwaukee, I'll bet she would do great. And I think of the two stories as being, in a way, bookends, because one is about why some people aren't able to access opportunity in a society where, to some substantial degree, it exists, and the other is about a family that created opportunity out of nothing. And they're products of two just very different histories. Angie was heir to this story of racial oppression and had no sense of opportunity in America, and Rosalie, from the other side of the world, sensed that there was something, if only she could get there, that it existed for her. Yes, ma'am.
But you're ignoring that Rosalie had been trained in the Philippines, that she was a nurse. We did not educate Rosalie. She came to Galveston to revive some sort of dying rural hospital. I think, I'm Italian, I'm an immigrant, and I'm not sympathetic to the country that uses actually an intellectual capital and a cultural capital created elsewhere. But that is the case, and
but the question is, why did Rosalie have the
nurse.
oomph to get through through nursing school because she
well,
perceived some opportunity out there.
Yes, but she was called and she waited to be called. And I think that it would be very interesting, and in Italy it has been done because Italy has the largest number of Filipino maids, but also many, many Filipino nurses. The nurses have quite a different trajectory than the maids, although, they all send money home. I'm sorry, but in the case of Rosalie, she was called here. She was given a job. She had no problems with a visa. Those are people that we're still trying to attract despite the 45th president.
But she got that, by the time she arrived here, she had a skill in a profession, but I think the question, one of the questions is what gave her the resilience to emerge from the slums and get through nursing school?
Yes, but
And I think she perceived even then that there was some opportunity for her, that if she could get this degree, it would pay off for her in a way that Angie never did. I'm not making a judgment about one or another. I'm just saying I'm making a judgment about the power of the traditions that they inherited. That Angie felt that accumulated sense of 6 generations of poverty and oppression in a way that Rosalie did not. Angie, in some carried a bigger burden in that way. Yeah.
You've chosen to present your remarks this afternoon in a sort of frame of success story, but your book, from which it comes, and I truly recommend it to everyone. It's so profound and educational. Is not at all heavy-handed ideologically and is so nuanced and multidimensional. I wonder if you were to also reflect on what was, without denying the success, what were some of the things about what the family went through that was particularly hard and costly and that maybe left some scars, or in any case, in the journey from Manila to the Philippines to America, what stands out as what they had to endure?
Thank you. Yeah, because when you boil it down, it sounds maybe a little easier and happier than it was. So, well, in Rosalie's case, she spent 8 years apart from her children. There were a lot of marital tensions also when the men got to Galveston. So you have 20 nurses, 19 are female. Most of them are married, so you have 17 or 18 male spouses trailing behind, all of whom are experiencing some version of downward mobility, both economically and and in terms of their status. So they're no longer really like, they're worried that they're no longer the heads of the family. This caused all kinds of conflict across the nurse families. Adultery, drinking, domestic violence. In Rosalie's case, Chris is a very gentle man. He doesn't drink. He's not violent. He's a wonderful father. But his version of like the man cave, the place he went when he needed to restore his sense of manhood, was a cockfighting farm on the outskirts of Houston, where he started raising fighting cocks. He didn't fight them, which is illegal in the United States, but he raised them and sent them back to the Philippines. So. It was a case where I started looking in the ethnography. The last thing on my mind when I got to Galveston was looking for gender conflict. But in reading other ethnographies, I found that this is just a big issue for lots of migration is feminized. So you see it in the family story. When Emmett went, it was the men who were mostly going abroad. By the time Rosalie's generation, 3/4 of the women going abroad from 3/4 of the migrants going abroad from the Philippines are women. So as migration feminized, you had lots of new tensions over gender. There's also a character in the book who loses a limb working on a cruise ship. The Filipinos, when they go abroad, I find this really revealing. They don't say, "I'm going off to make my fortune." They say, "I'm going to try my luck." I think it's just baked in that they know, they know there's a significant chance that something can go wrong. They can be cheated out of their wages. They can be physically harmed. They can have their marriages break up. They can have their children turned against them. There's that kind of the logo of the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, the government agency charged with looking after the welfare of workers, is a sun battling the rain. What government agency has a picture of a rain cloud in its logo? It's just, it's baked in the Philippines. People know that there's big risk.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. So I was kind of curious. It seemed like the thesis that you were making was that this greatest anti-poverty program is migration, and I wondered the extent to which you use that as a sort of rhetorical hook, or to the extent that you find that an actually persuasive argument, and then conversely, whether that would be a reasonable solution for poverty in America, for Americans to migrate abroad.
For Americans to migrate abroad. I thought you meant to bring in more migrants. Do I mean it? Yeah, I mean it, sure. Yeah, it's, gosh. Tita was the oldest, was one of 11 siblings. She had a 6th grade education. One of her younger daughters has a PhD, or younger siblings has a PhD that she got because her daughter was a cruise ship maid and paid for her to go back to grad school. So over the course of one generation, you see in her family the profound difference in educational accumulation, all made possible by remittances. Those 11 kids grew up in a thatched hut on the family farm. It's now got maybe 15 houses arrayed in a rough semicircle. When you drive in, you can look around and it's like an ocular form of carbon dating. You can tell which house, how long that worker was abroad. You know, the guy with like rough cement blocks and no windows went for 5 years, and the guy with the new roof went for 10 years. And Rosalie, being a nurse, Tita's house has a private water tank and pink paint, and it's the crown jewel of the compound. Go in any of the houses and they're going to have diplomas framed on the wall. The kids now, the newest status symbol is braces. The kids all want them, whether their teeth need them or not. The economic difference it's made in the life of this, I'm only talking about one extended family, but you can really see it there, and I think the evidence absolutely points towards that being a broader trend.
If I can follow that up, there is a counter-argument that you might want to comment on, that this kind of immigration flow, and especially in the Philippines, where it's associated with an economy that relies heavily on remittances, as you say, there are economists who say that not only does this involve some brain drain or skill drain, but that an economy that relies heavily on remittances, while it benefits individual families, stands in the way of national economic development. And some say that the problems in the Philippines now are associated with relying too heavily on exporting labor, getting some money back, but not providing for the kinds of development of industries within the Philippines that could really sustain the economy. You've gone back and forth a lot. How does it look to you?
Let me just say a quick word about how it happened in the Philippines. It's a story of really interesting historical timing. Ferdinand Marcos declares martial law in 1972. The OPEC oil embargoes in 1973. Oil prices quadruple worldwide. So the Persian Gulf states, which are already wealthy, are now wealthy beyond belief. They've got more money than they can possibly know what to do with, and they need workers desperately. They have roads to build, bridges, airports. I mean, there's nothing there. Marcos has a country where there's a communist insurgency and hordes of unemployed young men feeding into this insurgency. He's got to get young men out of the Philippines before they join the communists. Saudi Arabia desperately needs young men as workers, so it's like a marriage. Marcos announces this migration program, both because he wanted to get the remittances back from the Gulf, wanted the jobs, but also for security to get the men out of the Philippines. This was supposed to go on for 5 years. It was meant as a temporary fix to the national emergency, and just took hold so deeply that when I got to the Philippines, I really thought there was to report on the piece for the Times Magazine. I thought that part of that piece would be about the anti-migration movement in the Philippines, that there had to be some constituency, political, civil society that was really against. It's almost non-existent. It's just really hard to find. I mean, you can find a couple of people who carp about it, particularly at the University of the Philippines, or some academics, but people are voting with their feet. And So, part of my answer would be, let's say you're right theoretically. Does that what's the implication, ethically for people? Do they have an obligation to stay home in the hopes that in some small way it contributes to national development? Personally, I think the problems of the Philippine economy are so deep-rooted that stopping migration isn't going to be the solution. It's to the Philippines problem. I did think initially brain drain could be a big issue, but in the case of the nurses, at least, it's the opposite. There's such a international market for nurses that the number of nursing schools in the Philippines is quadrupled or quintupled, and there's actually a surplus of nurses. So many of them people go to nursing school, they go precisely to go abroad. So rather than being a brain drain, it's actually increased the number of nurses in the Philippines. Yes, ma'am. While we're waiting for the mic, can I should note that I'm very flattered that Professor Mark Miller is here from the University of Delaware. Mark wrote one of the first dissertations on migration in the entire field of political science. Was published in 1978 about guest workers in France. And when I first started working on this subject, he very generously took me under his wing, even shared a copy of his dissertation, which I've read. And he is also the author of a book called The Age of Migration, which is the standard textbook in the field and is now in its 6th edition. So thank you, Mark.
Hi, thanks for your time today. My name is Nicole. I'm a student at the School of Social Policy and Practice here at Penn. I apologize for coming in late, A, and B, I've not read the book, so forgive my naivety around this, but you used the term Americanized today when you referred to how the students, children in this family, have sort of assimilated into dominant culture here in the United States. Do you at all address in the book, and could you please today speak a little bit to what their Filipino culture is contributing to American culture as well, and add some of the strengths that they're bringing to the space?
When the kids got to Galveston, so Rosalie went ahead for 6 months and the kids followed later. When Rosalie and Chris brought the kids, Rosalie and Chris formed a very firm rule that the kids were only going to speak Tagalog in the household because they were going to retain their, quote, Filipino values. This was like the buzzword around the house. Nobody ever quite defined it, but it certainly involved speaking Tagalog was part of it. But they swore they were going to keep their Filipino values and speak Tagalog. And I think it lasted maybe 10 minutes. Those kids immediately stopped speaking Tagalog, started speaking English. American culture, Rosalie and Chris kept the TV on almost Filipino channel all the time, and the kids were constantly changing the channel or watching on their phones. Or I just had this image of like American culture pouring in through the windows, in their pockets, at school. There was just like no chance of them retreating into any kind of ethnic enclave. You asked what did they keep of their culture? I would the first two things I'd say would be family and religion. So they are family oriented in a way that is utterly unfamiliar to me culturally. So like if my brother-in-law comes for a weekend, that's a long time. The weekend, they'll take in a brother for a year, 2 years. It's not a problem. When they needed to go get a loaf of bread, 5 people have to go. People don't. They were a platoon. They went around Galveston. The 5 of them always went together. I got an invitation at one point for one of the girls to go to California from a foundation. Invited Rosalie to bring one of the girls. That was absolutely not a non-starter. They either all go or they don't go at all. And I also wish I had some pictures of Rosalie's living room, which she's got like a religious shrine in there. I don't know how many Santa Niños and special nurse prayers, and they're very devout. So what they got from it, those Tagalog didn't last. Family and religion did last. What What they got from the United States, I would say, is to a degree that really surprised me was the civil rights ethos. So there's that not just in Black History, or maybe because of Black History Month, not just Rosa Parks, but not just a story. They seem to imbibe it deeply. So at one point, Rosalie turns to the girls. They were 9 and 11, and said, "I really want you to marry Filipinos." And the girls look at her and Christine said, "Mommy, that's racist." And Laura said, "Yeah, it doesn't matter what color he is, it's just what's in his heart." And she's 9 years old. And Rosalie doubled down, she said, "No, we have to go back to the Philippines on vacation, and he should be Filipino, so he can go with us." And then they doubled down, and "No, Mommy, it doesn't matter what color you are." And that just absolutely wouldn't have happened, I don't think, in the Philippines. I was really struck by other instances of that. Do you know who Manny Pacquiao is, the great Filipino fighter? All right. He's fighting Floyd Mayweather, 2015. It's like a metaphor for good versus evil, because Pacquiao is the born-again Christian who gives all his money to the street children, and Floyd Mayweather is a convicted wife beater who posts pictures on his Instagram account of him laying in bed with piles of money. And it's American versus Filipino. So all the Filipinos gather in the Filipino cul-de-sac, 50 of them, to watch the movie. And Christine got very uncomfortable. She said she felt like all the Filipino nationalism, all the Filipinos screaming about the Philippines made her uneasy. She said it was, in her words, it was racist. She didn't want to take sides. So, I think that she's very uneasy with that kind of ethnic identity. Yes, is this a Manny Pacquiao question?
No, it's just a comment.
The only time I've ever seen Rosalie really get violent was at the Manny Pacquiao.
Yeah, they get intense.
"I just want one punch in his face," she screamed.
They get really intense. I actually agree with what she was saying. Because they demonize Floyd a lot at those parties, and it's I don't go to them. They're intense. But my family, it's just a quick comment. My family is of a generation of migrations. So my lolo, my grandpa, he came over in the 80s on a cruise ship. And he jumped ship with family drama, whatever. But he jumped ship with someone who was American, married her, and then he got my dad over here when he turned 18. And so then he became, my dad used to send money over and over for like all of his siblings that were with my Lola, and it was just a lot. But yeah, I just wanted to say, like, it was really cool to like see that, to like hear this and see this, because I don't hear a lot about it, because when my dad came over here, he had such a thick accent that no one would really give him a job, even though he had a degree from the Philippines in like computer science and technology, and he just couldn't get a job because they saw his last name and they heard his accent, and then they were like, "No, you can't." So he profusely just speaks English. Now it's a little bit looser. He like gets back into Tagalog and stuff, but he would profusely like make himself Americanized because he couldn't get a job either way, because they would like his name is Carlito, and instead of going by that, he goes by Butch, because his dad is he was Carlito Sr. and he calls himself Butch, so he's like, "Okay, I'm gonna call myself Butch too." But yeah, the Americanized thing.
The remittance thing, I'm glad you mentioned that, because about the strength of the family devotion to each other. Rosalie is now completely supporting both her. Emmett died last year. Tita's now, so Tita's a widow. Rosalie is completely supporting Tita, Rowena, her sister, and one of her brothers had a stroke. Plus, I mean, she's responsible for 100% of their upkeep, plus endless numbers of nieces and nephews, and she'll get Facebook messages from people she went to school with that she hasn't seen in 20 years, saying they have cancer or asking for money. The constant request, it's like a hole you can't fill. And one of Rosalie's real struggles for her was to figure out how to draw a line so that she could have a life of her own. So when she bought the house, she felt really guilty about doing something that much for herself, and she knew that the family would resent it back in the Philippines. It's like going through life with this constant tax that you're always paying for your family.
Hi. Can you talk more about your first few months in Leveriza? And this is related to...
You say it better than me.
I guess this is related to the question about the validity of the stories, because I do feel like when you do ethnographic research with Filipino families or Filipino culture in general, you have to reach a level of not being the other in Filipino, hindi ibang tao, that you're already part of the community. So did you feel that you have breached that level? I guess that's my question also, in talking about your first few days or first few months in Leveriza.
Well, I wouldn't say I breached in my first few months. I didn't go to Leveriza as an ethnographer or even as a journalist. I was on a sabbatical from journalism. I just went because I was interested in slum life in the developing world. I was thinking of leaving journalism and maybe becoming a social worker or like doing something less observational. And so I was kind of there to work out I think in religious language, I was undergoing a process of discernment, what was my calling, so I moved into this slum. So it was a very strange, it just had no definition to it. I asked Sister Christine, could you give me a job just so I'd have some structure? And she said it should come from the people, but the people didn't have any, it's like no relationship I've ever had because there was no definition of it whatsoever. It wasn't for any purpose. I didn't go there to write about Tita. And we just formed a friendship that I think surprised both of us. I think we were both probably lonely. I mean, it was really lonely for me to be in I don't know how many of you have done ethnography, but it sounds fun, was in retrospect, but at the time it was really hard. I was 26, I was living in a shanty town by myself, getting letters from friends who were getting married and getting new jobs and going on with their lives, and I'm like, what am I doing? I'm a resident, journalist in residence or something in this shanty town. And Tita was lonely too because her husband was away, and we'd sit around and have talks about why does God allow suffering? It was just a friendship, and it went on for 20 years. I left and I didn't know if I'd ever see her again, and it was only really 20 years later that I picked up the relationship again as a journalist. So over the course of those 20 years, I think our relationship changed, and I think they would describe it, or I would also describe it as kind of a fictive kin. They call me Kuya, which is brother, but certainly that didn't happen in the first few days or months when I was working. Tina and I were both equally terrified of the situation. Yeah, I attribute it to them more than any skill I had. Tita was a wonderful letter writer. My mom died recently, and I found in my mom's house letters that Tita had written to her when I was living with her 30 years ago, just to assure my mother that I was okay. My mom's name was Joan. Dear Mommy Joanne, she wrote. Don't worry, Jason's okay.
Right here. Based on the sheer number of individuals in the Philippines who do go and become migrant workers, this seems like the ultimate success story. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the prevalence of this success story among, you talked about how the Philippines is really churning out migrant workers, and how many of them do end up with this ultimate success story versus going abroad for a few years, having money, and then coming back and the money runs out, or other issues that happen. So
completely off the top of my head, I guess I would rank this maybe like Rosalie's probably at the 80th or 90th percentile of success stories. Yeah, she's better than average, but she's not like a 1 in a million. And she's the one I'm talking about today. She's the main focus of the book, but I tried to build in other characters whose experiences were sufficiently different to give the sense that she's not meant to be representative of every migrant worker. I don't think you couldn't find one person who is, So there are characters in the book whose marriages break up, who have out-of-wedlock children when they go overseas. One, like I said, who loses a limb. People who get cheated out of all their money. One family sells the farm to send their kid to become a factory worker, to pay the illegal recruiter fees to become a factory worker in Taiwan, and he goes abroad and drinks up, gambles, and washes out after 3 months, and they've lost their whole. I mean, all kinds of bad stuff happens. And then there's also political narratives about nannies who get murdered overseas. There was a recent case in the Philippines where a Filipino nanny was found, in a freezer and chopped up in a freezer in Kuwait. I mean, I think if you read the whole story, you understand that this is a risky business and it turns out badly for a lot of people. That said, Rosalie, there's also a lot of Rosalies.
So can you tell us a little bit about your role in this did you ever give them money? Did you ever help pay off debts in terms of gifts, like negotiating the boundary, and also how, I mean, it's not like you don't have IRB like we have in social sciences, but the walking HIPAA violation that you mentioned, the challenges and ethical dilemmas you faced managing this. Did the kids ever not want you around? It must have been a big shock when the kids showed up for their parents. They weren't used to living with their parents, and were you being in that space when
kids
there
always
was
wanted
tension?
me around because I was a source of Oreo McFlurries.
I see. So you would treat them with Oreo McFlurries.
I would bribe them with Oreo McFlurries, yeah, sure.
And also about how she set limits with the people who wanted money from her. Yeah.
Yeah, I got asked about the IRB. I gave a talk at Columbia earlier this week, and somebody asked me if I'd said that since I was doing human subject experimentation, did I have an IRB? I think what you call human subject experimentation, we call it interviewing. But I get asked about that a fair amount, like what were the rules, and I can understand why it would seem like an issue from the outside. It rarely was for me. It really felt like a conflict. I did my earlier book. I was very worried about just this subject. I was worried that. First of all, I was worried about, I had to have rules about not giving the money family, because I thought, giving the family money, I thought that would never, if I got started on that, it would never end and it would change the relationship. I didn't want that to happen. I was also worried about the Heisenberg principle. I didn't want to change the story I was writing about. I didn't want to become a social worker for the family and give it an unnatural outcome. So Angie got off of welfare and was trying to get, lost her health insurance. And one of the policy questions about welfare was, when people left, were they going to be able to find health insurance? So I didn't do anything. She didn't have health insurance. I was kind of waiting to see, would Angie figure it out and get health insurance. And my wife, the health policy official, came to Milwaukee, and we had a meal with Angie. And Nancy Ann said, "Oh, you don't have health insurance? Well, I know a program. I can get you signed up. It's called Badger Care. I can take you out there tomorrow." And I was kicking her under the table. Difference between a journalist and a good person. By the end of that project, so I went into it thinking I got to be really careful. I don't want to change the story. By the end of it, I thought, there's nothing I can do that's going to change this story. After the end of the reporting, I took the kids on a cross-country trip to try to get them. I got them into a boarding school in Colorado, and Angie said she wasn't going to send them there because people in Colorado are shooting. She was thinking about Columbine. The kids went. They got mad that the school didn't have cable, and that they got in some fight with some guys over some girl. I mean, just the whole thing was and I can't wait for thinking that no matter how hard I tried, I wasn't able to make I didn't know what I could do to help the family. So I had a very different perspective on it. By the time I got to Rosalie, she'd been my friend. By the time I started writing a book about her, she'd been my friend for 20-something years. I'd helped her go to nursing school. I had contributed over these years. So there was no pretense that this was an arm's length relationship. I didn't, there's nothing, I don't set the book up as though I went out and found a migrant family at random and, wrote about them as a journalist. I tell the book starts with the story of me landing on Tita's doorstep, and both of us trying to figure out what to do with each other. So it's doesn't purport to be an arm's length transaction. The only time I really had a debate about it, and the few times where it became an issue, I tried to just be transparent in the book and explain. So the chief time was Rosalie had gotten approved for her visa, but she hadn't actually gotten the piece of paper. So you get approved, you go through the whole process for 20 years. They say, great, your visa is approved. We'll tell you when to come back and we'll put it in your passport. And it was the day before she was about to leave to go to the United States. She didn't have the visa. If she didn't get it, she was going to miss the plane. She might be late for the job. She'd lose some income. She might potentially lose the job. And it turns out I had an appointment that day with an embassy official, just because I was trying to learn about the visa process. So I'm in the interview with the consular officer, and I'm debating, it was the consular officer who had approved her visa. I'm wondering, should I tell her? And part of me thought, no, it's a better story journalistically if she doesn't get the visa, and then she misses the plane, and it would make a point that for all the talk of open borders, they're not so open. It's hard even for migrants as privileged as Rosalie. So the journalist in me wanted to just let the situation go, and then the other part of me thought, oh my God, she's been at this 20 years. We got to get this visa. So I mentioned it I hesitated, and I mentioned it to the woman, and she very sweetly got up and said, let me see what I can do, and returned in 5 minutes, and Rosalie had the visa. But I described that in the book, so people know my role. But for the most part, it just didn't feel like I ever had to, that they were asking me to do things that I didn't want to do, or vice versa. Do we have time for, is it one more? You? Okay.
Hi, my name's Caitlin. I'm an undergraduate student here. Part of my family comes from the Philippines, and when they came here, all they had to do was they needed to learn English, and they had to put all this effort into learning English, and English was the way to succeed in America. So why did you, as a foreigner, as a Westerner, go into the Philippines and not learn the native language and not learn the customs? What do you think your role was there? Why do you think that you didn't give back the same way that immigrants in America gave back to America, and you didn't learn the language, the native language of the Philippines?
Oh, I took Tagalog. I had a Tagalog tutor, and I'm not real good at language, but I tried. In terms of giving back, I kind of think of my relationship with the family as being a way of, I tried to stay in touch with them and give back to them through our 30-year friendship. Thanks so much.